My name is Arianna Smith. I'm 25 years old. Today is April 19th, 2008, and we are in my hometown, Sacramento, California, and I'll be interviewing my mother.
My name is Elisa Zitano. I'm 59 years old. Today's date is April 19th, 2008. We're here in Sacramento, California, and I'm going to be interviewed and also perhaps share a dialogue with my daughter, Arianna.
So I was hoping that we could talk about one of your driving trips across the country before I was born, when you were in college.
You've probably heard this story many times before, but it's a lot of fun for me to tell. And I've done many driving trips across country, including the one that I hope we'll talk about later that we shared. But this was one of the most interesting for me. I was about 20 years old and was in my last year of college at the University of North Dakota. And my roommate, Nikki, and I wanted to drive out to California where my family was living in order for me to have some interviews at local school districts with the hope that I would be hired after I graduated. And Easter break was like the last week of March. This was in 1970. And so we got into Nikki's car. She had about a 63 Volkswagen with no snow tires, just actually kind of bald tires. And we put down the back seat so that we could have an ice cooler and have our luggage in there. And the two of us set out at the beginning of Easter break to drive to Sacramento, California from Grand Forks, North Dakota. And we made the drive nonstop in a couple of days. We didn't stop. We didn't have any money, so we didn't stop in any motels. We didn't do anything except stop to eat or get coffee and trade off driving. And we had a really, really good week of weather. So those couple of days, even though we went through the Rockies and we drove through areas that could have had pretty bad winter weather, we didn't have any problems at all. Made a very good trip. And when you're that age, of course, you can drive all night and drive all day and do that on not much sleep. So we had our visit with my family in actually Rancho Cordova, and I had a couple of interviews, and it was a pretty successful trip. And then we had to head back because we had to be back for school. It was getting to be the last few days of Easter break, and we set out fairly late in the afternoon from Sacramento, heading east, going into the Sierra Nevada. That was fine. We crossed over into Nevada, went past Reno, and then it started snowing and blowing. And there was just no let-up to it. We drove through the night with the blizzards all around us, crossed through Utah in the blizzards, and then had to cut up toward Wyoming. And we drove through the night, through the day. By the time we were well into Wyoming, we had to stop every now and then because the ice and snow were building up so much on the inside of those big round Volkswagen fenders that the ice and snow would be literally 3/4 of an inch from the turning tire. And the vehicle was being weighed down by all this heavy ice. So we would pull over and knock all the ice off and get started again and drive as long as we could before the ice would build up again. And I don't know what we were thinking, but we just kept driving because we had to keep driving. We finally got to the place where we were in Laramie, Wyoming, and we had to take the highway between Laramie and Cheyenne. And it was just a terrible blizzard. They stopped us outside of Laramie and said, "You really should turn back and stay in Laramie. We're just about to close down this highway, and there's really a lot of trouble up ahead." And we said, "Oh, but we don't have any money, and we're 20 years old, and we have to get back to school, so I think we'll just keep driving." And we did. We went on through. There were jackknifed trucks everywhere. I have since been on that road, and I can't believe that we did that in a raging blizzard. But we just kept driving, and we persevered and got through that particular section, made it to Cheyenne, and then continued on. Later on, after dark, poor Nikki was really getting tired, and she just had to sleep. So I took over again at the wheel, and it was dark, and we were getting ready to go into South Dakota. And I didn't want to bother Nikki to wake her up, so I just pulled over and consulted the map, looking for the shortest route to get us to the interstate that we needed. And I don't know what I was thinking, but I wasn't thinking about the weather, and I just said, "Oh, here's the shortest route. It looks a little curvy, but I'll just follow this way." And I proceeded to drive that Volkswagen into a blasting blizzard into the Black Hills of South Dakota. The snow was coming down so hard I couldn't tell sometimes if I was driving forward or going sideways, and I don't know how I negotiated that road. I just kept driving. I realized after a while where I was, there was no one there because this is strictly a summer vacation spot, and there were no tracks on the roads because no cars had been driving over those roads. At any rate, eventually Nikki woke up, and she said, "Where are we?" And I said, "Well, we're driving through the Black Hills of South Dakota." And we were going pretty slow, and it was snowing really hard. And she said, well, how did we get here?" And I told her, "Well, I thought I was taking the shortest route, and I guess I got us on this road, and I guess it's not the shortest route now." She said, "Well, that's okay, so long as we don't run into any grizzly bears." And I said, "Oh, no," and I honestly said this, it was the truth. "Oh, no, I know that I recently read that there are no grizzly bears in South Dakota." And it wasn't 2 minutes later that we came to a little bridge over Grizzly Bear Creek. We both looked at each other like we were going to be in big trouble because we didn't know what to do. The end of the story is that we did persevere. We got through that night, and the snowing subsided while we were still in South Dakota early that morning. And we did make it back to Grand Forks, North Dakota, in time to collapse at our apartment for a few hours and then get up and go to the first day of school after spring break. And the moral to the story, I guess, is when you're 20 years old, you think you're immortal, and you do things that you would never do when you're 40 years old. But it was a wonderful trip and an interesting lesson learned.
Would you have let me do that when I was 20 years old?
There would be a lot of things I would have changed about that trip. First of all, you would have had plenty of resources in your pocket to stop and stay in a motel if you had to, and you would not have been driving a Volkswagen with no tire chains and no snow tires. That was also a lesson learned.
Did your parents say anything about that trip to you when you told them about it?
Well, my dad was still in the Air Force at that time, and he was away in Thailand. It was during the Vietnam War. And my mom didn't realize that we could have been facing those kinds of dangers. I think it never occurred to her. She never realized what a really dangerous trip it was that time of year and under those circumstances.
That's quite a vacation, spring break for you.
Not exactly Girls Gone Wild, but
well, we had a very different trip a couple years, about 25 or 30 years later.
Yes, we did.
When I planned to spend the summer in Connecticut, and I had a job with a summer camp for underprivileged inner city youth, and so my mother offered to drive across the country with me in my Honda Accord coupe the beginning of that summer. And I know I had a great time doing that, and I wanted to talk to you about that a little bit and see how you felt with each leg of the drive and how we switched off and how it was a little bit different from your trip so much earlier.
That drive was really one of the highlights of my life, I have to say that. Spending that time with you in the car on that trip was really special. And it did offer quite a contrast to my trip much earlier with Nikki. It's interesting to me that I'm feeling emotional about it, but it was a really, really good time. What I loved about it was being with you in that wonderful adventure situation of, wow, we have 3,000 miles to drive, and it's always an adventure to cross this beautiful country in a car and to be much closer to the scenery, not 30,000 feet above it, but right there. And to have the assignment, the daily assignment of miles to drive and a place that you have to get to on the map. All of that is really exciting to me, and doing it with you was really special. I recall that we left, I believe it was on a Friday morning, and we left early. It was in June, thank goodness, beautiful weather. And we decided that we were going to go about 635 miles that day from Sacramento to Salt Lake City. And having done a lot of cross-country driving, I really was afraid that 635 miles would be a lot of mileage for us to cover that day. So we got an early start and made our way through the Sierras, through Nevada, into Utah, through the Salt Flats, and we made it to Salt Lake City with time to spare and daylight to spare. And I thought that set the tone for the rest of the trip, because we knew then we could do 650 miles without even blinking. It didn't hurt that you could do 80 through Nevada and 80 through Utah, but we did it. And so that kind of set a wonderful air of confidence for us after that. The next day, Saturday morning, we headed out of Salt Lake City, and after just a couple of hours of driving, we were into Wyoming. And I recall crossing Wyoming, going east in the morning and early afternoon in the most beautiful light. The sunlight was just perfect. And because we were able to drive 75 or 80 miles an hour, about every hour the scenery really changed. Remember how you'd be in lush mountains, and then you'd be in some sort of rocky, craggy area, and then you'd be in broad plains. And we reached a point where someone had said, well, we didn't have a lot of time to do side trips on the way out to Connecticut, but that there was a good drive that took us up into I believe, the Snowy Mountains before we got to Cheyenne, where we were planning to stop for the night. And we did take that drive. At one point, the road was really torn up because there was a lot of road construction going on, and we had learned earlier in the day that cell phones don't work in Wyoming. I don't know why, too far from anything, I guess. So we didn't have cell phones to fall back on. And I was interested that I was kind of really anxious to push on, and you seemed a little hesitant when the road really, really got pretty bad from the construction, and the construction workers weren't there. So we were out in the middle of nowhere and could have been stuck in pretty deep dirt if we weren't careful. But just before we decided to turn around, another car was coming from the other direction, and they told us, oh yeah, the pavement is just 100 yards ahead. And we proceeded and got up into some beautiful snowy mountains. I mean, deep snow, remember? And then when we came down from those mountains, we were again into a huge, broad plain. The prairie grasses were still green, and we saw big herds of antelope, again in that golden light later in the day, and got into Cheyenne with daylight to spare. I had always wanted to stop in Cheyenne because I had never had the money as a student to stop there, and so here we were making a trip where we had all the resources we needed, and I made a reservation for us to stay at the Little America in Cheyenne because when I was a student, that always looked like the place I wanted to stop and sleep at. And as I recall, the Little America was kind of run down as far as the public buildings and restaurants went, but our room was very, very nice. But we were disappointed that we couldn't find any interesting Wyoming food that night. We ended up eating at like an Outback steakhouse or something. But the next morning, before we left town, we explored the old part of Cheyenne, which has been beautifully renovated in many places down by the railroad station. And we found the Plains Hotel, which I think was probably a turn of the 20th century, maybe 1915, 1920 kind of hotel that had been very nicely renovated. And the Plains Hotel dining room had a wonderful breakfast that you just recently reminded me of. It was incredible biscuits and gravy, and it was in a beautifully renovated room. So we prevailed on the food search that day there at the Plains Hotel.
Well, certainly that morning, and then we went onward towards Nebraska, where the scenery definitely didn't change hour by hour.
It did get a little monotonous in Nebraska. We stopped in Lincoln for the night, and then we decided to get out of Lincoln as early as we could the next morning, and it took a long time for some reason to find the interstate. We really wanted to get out of town, and we're having some trouble doing that, but we eventually did, and we got into Iowa that morning. And do you remember about the drivers in Iowa?
Yeah. The drivers in Iowa were they put the drivers in Los Angeles to shame in a lot of ways. They were. It was like you crossed that Mississippi River and all of a sudden you're on the East Coast with on the east side of the country with the really crazy drivers. But you know what I remember driving into Iowa was that it was all of like 8 a.m. at that point. We'd been on the road for like an hour and a half, and we had the Beach Boys playing, and we were driving through those rolling Iowa farm hills with the red barns and just as pastoral and as could possibly be, and and have. I wish they all could be California girls playing on the car stereo.
That was exactly what I was remembering too. That it was California Girls we were listening to. It was perfect.
Yes.
Even with people driving 2 feet from our back bumper at 80 miles an hour. My best recollection of Iowa for that trip was when it was lunchtime and we were just determined that we were not going to stop at one of the chain restaurants along the freeway. We decided we would try to find something different. And after looking for quite a while, we saw a sign. It was along the freeway, and it was to a cafe and ice cream parlor in a little town. We decided to get off and kind of follow the signs to get to that ice cream parlor. And I think we probably drove, as I recall, maybe 5 or 6 miles away from the interstate and found this little town. I wish I could remember the name of it. And I marvel to this day. It seemed as we drove into that town as though someone had just finished painting every building white and mowed the lawns. Everything was perfect in that little town. And we found the cafe, and we had good sandwiches and great ice cream, and sat outside. It was just a lovely day. And then before we left, we went to the back to use the restroom. And it was like, while we were sitting there eating lunch, someone changed all the fixtures and put new fixtures in because everything was gleaming. And I want to go back to that town to see if what I remember is true about how it was just a perfect little shining place that we found. It was a nice addition to our adventure.
And then that afternoon, we drove through the lower half of Illinois and into Indiana. And then we stopped in South Bend for the night.
That's right. There was a lot of traffic. I believe that was a Sunday, and I think there were a lot of people coming back to Chicago. And so we got stuck in a lot of traffic in that area. But then we did make it to South Bend that night, and the next morning we got a chance to walk around the Notre Dame campus, which was a fun, brief diversion before getting back on the road. And the way I remember the rest of the trip, because from that point on, we were back in civilization. We weren't on the broad plains anymore. We had to do a lot more of team driving, where one of us would drive and the other would navigate us through and around big cities. But we made our goal. I think last night that we stopped was Jamestown, New York, and the next day we were there in the Hartford, Connecticut area, where you spent the summer.
Yeah, that was quite a drive. I think I remember as we were getting off on the exit to the home that I was staying in, and it was the last turn that we had to make, and I told you to turn left instead of right.
That's right.
And you were really frustrated that we had made one wrong turn in the entire trip, and it had to be that last turn, and it made us about 5 minutes late to the place where we were going.
That's right. You drive 3,000 miles and then you take a wrong turn. When we drove back, I met you in Chicago, and that always amazed me, that I flew into the airport in Chicago, turned on my cell phone, called you. You said, "I'm waiting at the baggage pickup place." It went like clockwork to meet up and get on the road from Chicago. And my favorite part of that trip was when we drove through South Dakota and ended up in Rapid City.
Yeah, that was 400 miles of flat, plain country and billboards. What was your
Oh,
favorite billboard that we saw?
well, that really was interesting. I'm glad that you reminded me of that. When we were driving kind of past a very small town, the first billboard we saw was a very, very adamant statement about anti-abortion. And we thought, my goodness, this is a small town with a very strong opinion about this. And before we were through the town, the very next billboard we saw was a very strong pro-choice, pro-life statement. And we thought the people of this town must have some very interesting discussions.
I think my favorite billboard, as we were driving past, was every 20 miles there was the reptile zoo being advertised on the other end of the state. And you'd think, why would you want to go to a reptile zoo in South Dakota? But then you realize that after you've been driving that long with that much flat country, with that little to look at, you really, really do want to go see those reptiles by the end of the trip.
Even a reptile zoo would be more interesting. Well, and then, of course, we did stop. We made sure we had time in Rapid City to drive into Custer State Park and Mount Rushmore. You had not seen Mount Rushmore before. It was kind of a quick trip to see Mount Rushmore, but everyone should see it. And then our drive in Custer State Park was really fun. Do you remember?
Yeah. What was your favorite part about Custer State Park?
Well, actually, when we were talking earlier, I was reminded about the prairie dog town. When we saw that there was kind of a marked prairie dog town, we sort of pulled over, and then we realized it was acres and acres of little mounds with these little prairie dogs all sitting up, kind of waving hi to us. It was an amazing sight.
And then a few miles later, then what else did we see a couple miles later?
Well, we saw a lot of bison, a lot of buffalo at the Custer State Park. I believe that they have some of the biggest herds in the country. And at one point, a lot of cars had slowed down to look at the buffalo along the side of the road. We had to slow down and stop as well. And then all of a sudden we realized we were surrounded by the herd. And more than that, in front of us was a buffalo calf, just standing there looking at us. It wouldn't move. The other cars were able to go on, but we were surrounded by the herd. And behind that Honda Accord was a great big bull buffalo who was bigger than the car, who had a look in his eye of, if you hurt that calf, you'll never get a chance to hurt another buffalo calf again. Somehow we got through that herd. The herd parted, I guess, like the Red Sea, and we were able to move on. That was a great adventure.
And then the next day, we drove down towards Wyoming and ended up going through Yellowstone.
That's right. We went through Cody, Wyoming, and entered Yellowstone. I think it was the east entrance, and they had just opened the road after a big forest fire, a huge forest fire, and they allowed us to drive through. We were some of the few people driving, but they allowed us to drive through, and we had to drive all the way through Yellowstone Park at 25 miles an hour at the end of a long day of driving. And it was because we had to stay out of the way of the emergency vehicles and things that were still there. But it took a long time to get to Jackson Hole, Wyoming that day. But I do remember we got into the area where you could really, really see the Tetons around sunset. And there's nothing more energizing than seeing that kind of country. This country has so many beautiful places, but the Tetons are like the microcosm mountain range. And the next morning we went out to see them again. And they're just something that all Americans need to make contact with. It's such an elemental thing, such beauty. Anyway, I thought that was pretty much the high point. Those were the high points of the trip home. Although we did still have some very long driving to get us from there to Salt Lake City and then back to Sacramento.
But by then we were pros at it.
Oh, we knew when to trade off, and actually that was one other thing I wanted to mention was throughout that entire trip, both all the way out and all the way back, I never once felt drowsy. I never felt tired of driving. I never felt as though I couldn't drive another mile. I simply couldn't believe the energy that being in that situation gave me. And it was a feeling of adventure and discovery and just us coming closer together, and everything about it was worth being wide awake for.
Yeah, that was a fun trip.
Let's do it again. Soon.
I hope so.
We've done some other traveling together, most notably in 2005 when we were in Italy for a month together.
And we flew there, and we took some side trips to London and
Venice
and Rome. And it was just as fun, but in completely different ways.
I wanted to ask you what you recalled as the really remarkable moment of our month together there in Italy.
I think there was a lot of interesting things, coincidences that happened at that time. The day we got there, Pope John Paul II passed away. And
that's right, the day we arrived in Italy.
20 days later, the day we got to Rome, was the day that Pope Benedict XVI was elected. But I think one of my favorite memories was just that first day that it was really sunny and nice, and we were in the Boboli Garden
in Florence,
and just spending time out in the sun at the top of the hill in Tuscany, and just enjoying the sunlight and enjoying spending some time together. That was wonderful.
Especially since we then had so little sunshine there in Florence for most of that month of April. Actually, I wanted to tell you about one of my really seminal moments when we were together in Rome. It was, we were only there a couple of days, and it was early in the morning. We were at the top of the Spanish Steps, which was close to our hotel, and we were on our way to St. Peter's in the Vatican, which had been a mob scene only a few days earlier because of all of the election of the Pope and all of that followed. But we were standing at the top of the Spanish Steps, and you had been waiting for some very important news. You were concerned about, you really wanted to be accepted into a school program, and it was something that was very important to us. And Dad was back home, and he told us that he would let us know as soon as he knew. So there we were. It was probably 8 o'clock in the morning Rome time, and it was probably midnight in California, and we got the cell phone call from Dad, and standing there at the top of the Spanish Steps, you got bad news that you hadn't gotten into the program. And it was a really huge disappointment. And you said, as soon as you were finished on the phone, you said, well, let's not talk about this right now. Let's go to the Vatican and have a great day. And we did exactly that. We went to St. Peter's. Everyone was gone. They had all spent all their time and all their money waiting for the election of the Pope, and that was the day before, and they were all gone. We walked up to St. Peter's Basilica and practically walked right in and had a wonderful visit there. And then we said, well, now let's go to the Vatican Museum. And I kept saying, well, okay, we better start walking over there because we're going to have to stand in line for a long time. I'm pretty sure this is the way. And we walked down one street and we turned the corner, and I said, any minute now we're going to be standing in a long line, and we're going to be stuck in this line for an hour before we can get tickets to get in. And we kept walking and walking and walking and walked right up to the ticket booth, bought a ticket, walked in, and had pretty much the entire museum to ourselves. We couldn't go to the Sistine Chapel because it was still involved in the election of the Pope, which was, by the way, exactly 2 years ago today. But we got to enjoy the Raphael rooms almost alone, and the Laocoon and all of the wonderful art there was to see there. It was a terrific day, and we took photographs at the Castel Sant'Angelo, and that night, as we sat outside having a drink and getting ready for dinner, you said, now let's talk about it. And we talked about the program and the disappointment and what you would do next. And I thought that I was very, very proud of you. I thought it was one of the most mature things that a young woman your age could have been doing at that time. The way you handled that. There was no way that you were going to say, I'm here in Rome and I have a day to see the Vatican, but I've just had a disappointment and I'm not going to enjoy that day. And instead, you demonstrated a level of maturity that made me very, very proud. Again, that was one of the finest days I'll ever remember. And it was great traveling with you, honey.
Well, I'm sure I learned that maturity from you. And it was wonderful traveling with you, too.
Thank you for saying so. I love you, babe.
I love you, too, Mom.